Hello and welcome to this edition of Going Back, the University of Georgia's oral history recording program. My name is Bob Castro, and 30 years ago, wow, been 30 years, I was very fortunate to be able to work in this studio as a student worker when I was attending the journalism school at the University of Georgia. And I was also fortunate to then have a staff position afterwards. So I spent 8 years in this studio and control room and was very fortunate to work with a fantastic crew of dedicated professionals. And two of them I have with me today, Dr. Bill Hale and David Fisher. And they're going to help us go back in time. Now, Dr. Hale, I understand that you were the Associate Director for the Communications Division, and you functioned essentially as our station manager,
right,
if I understand that correctly. And the dates I have are 1962 to 1987.
Right.
And David Fisher?
I had several. I was hired as a producer director, and I was supposed to help train other producer directors because I had some experience with Jerry Oppie, who was the station manager, and Hill Vermont, who was the program director before in Atlanta. So I promised that I would stay here a year, and I think I stayed here 33 years. So I kept my promise.
So to say, it must have been like a year as far as the planet Neptune was concerned, one of their years.
In those days, television directors and producers were always looking for better jobs, and they could always find them because television stations were new and people were moving up, and also people were looking at New York and Hollywood for this kind of business. And so they wanted to be sure that if they hired me, that I would stay for at least a year, because sometimes they didn't. Directors didn't stay.
Well, today is Saturday, August 7th, 2010, and we are in the Georgia Center for Continuing Education on the South Campus of UGA. Now, David Fisher, would you please tell our audience the significance of this particular space, this studio, and the fact that it has been, I think, in continuous use as a television studio for now more than half a century. How did the university come to get its own television station for a while?
That's a story that Bill can answer better than I can.
Okay.
So,
well, if you go back to the Kellogg Foundation, who wanted to put continuing education in this country and picked universities to put it. The first one they built was at Michigan State.
that's right.
That was the first center.
Called
Kellogg. The Kellogg Center. And then applications were sought from other universities. In this particular case, University of Texas, NC State, and the University of Georgia applied for the next Georgia Center, for the Center of Continuing Education. And all three of these went in. Hugh Masters, who became the director of this center for quite a while, was Director of Educational Services at Kellogg Foundation. And Hugh was an innovative, creative person who looked around to see things that were going to happen. What happened, and you have to just, okay. These three applications went in, and Hugh Masters made site visits to these three places. When he came here to this place, he loved Athens. He loved Athens, and I think he gave Athens, the people who wrote the grant, gave them the idea, if you will include into this, your application, this fascinating thing called television, you might be one up. They put that in there, okay, and Hugh Masters, then they were given the grant. To Georgia was given that grant. And immediately they got a construction permit, got Channel 8, the biggie VHF station, and then Hugh Masters decided he would leave Kellogg and come here. And with O.C. Adderhold as the president, and the Dean Drury at the journalism school, there was a lot of campus let's call it simple politics. Should this be just given to the center, or should this be a laboratory for the journalism school to teach? And Hugh Masters, being a man who did not have a great deal of admiration for administration of any kind, which bore out in his time here, there was actually there was a meeting in a Chicago hotel with Dean Drury, Hugh Masters, O.C. Adderhole, and Joe Williams, who happened to be Dean of Education, in which they were going to hone this thing out. And O.C. was basically thought that maybe the journalism school should have a part. In that meeting, Hugh Masters said, if journalism school is involved in this thing, you will not get the grant. I'll just take it some other place. So that was the thing that separated the academic wing from the Georgia Center of Continuing Education. So we got it, that's the way we got it. And then, I don't know when that grant was made, probably 1956, 7. The center was built, and then out on Jacks Creek Mountain, they built this high tower. And we went on, that's how television got into continuing education here.
Well, actually, I would say, because the grant asked for a television station, including, as well as a center for continuing education, which is what Kellogg was interested in. Because we had the television station in the grant, that's why the Continuing Education Center came to Georgia, rather than North Carolina State or Texas, and they were the 3 finalists.
Yeah,
there were many more applications.
Only that round. There were 3 finalists in that round.
Right.
Okay, and then the other thing is that they wanted to have television and make it. It was never really to be not part of the instruction of the campus. That was never intended. It was to be supportive of continuing education's program. In fact, they, not knowing enough about television at that time, they assumed that they'd put up a signal and just go everywhere. It'd cover the people coming to conferences. The whole point was to use television to drum up trade, give people pre-training, bring them here, and then send it back out. And to take these programs that happened at the center, these educational programs, and put them on the air. Well, the egg and the chicken, none of that, it never seemed to happen that way. And so we never did become a instructional unit for the campus. We did instruction, well, we had only evening programming. For a long time, we ran the State Department of Education's to the schools during the daytime.
So it sounds like from your description, television was central to the Georgia Center, and that's interesting because in the 8 years I worked here, I wasn't aware of that part of the story.
Television is what made Kellogg award the University of Georgia the center. So without the television part of it, there wouldn't be a center.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's what most people don't remember.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So from your description, it sounds like I'm assuming Kellogg, and maybe Mr. Masters as well, assumed that television would be part of the continuing education cycle.
Was the whole thing. He was an educator.
Yes.
He came out of Texas, and he did a lot of wonderful. He had a couple of nationally known programs in education that he did. But then he came here as the director, and it was an interesting thing because he brought a lot to weight. He
brought the money.
He brought the money, and he knew he could get more of it from Kellogg. He knew how to do that, and so he was a powerful figure here, and independent as all get out. Wow, the independence. But
so how did? Actually, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I would like to cover how then public television evolved from strictly continuing education, but then having to use entertainment.
It never happened that way. It never was it a supportive thing for conferences. Conferences did their thing, and we didn't know how do you cover them, and where do you send them? What do you do? Now we built in media into conferences and all that, but it never worked that way.
No, the conferences didn't run the television station. Hugh Masters, Dr. Masters, hired as his communications director and station manager prior to Bill a guy named Gerard Oppie. Gerard Oppie had been a program director at Channel 11. He had run one of the big theaters on top of the Big Circle Theater, biggest theater in Atlanta, and brought in Hollywood stars, New York stars. He had run that theater. He had run that theater with a guy named Hill Vermont. Hill Vermont was a director at Channel 11, and later I became a director at Channel 11 and met Hill Vermont. Hill Vermont taught me a lot about lighting. He was great at lighting. He taught me a lot about drama, and he taught me a lot about how to make educational things entertaining. And it means back when I first saw educational television, it wasn't on a public station. It was on CBS, I think, at 6 o'clock in the morning. And what it was some professor standing there with a piece of chalk in his hand, writing on a board and teaching as if he were in a classroom. That's exactly what we did not want to do in public television or in the television station in Athens.
The fact that Hugh Masters went that direction, rather than going around the country finding academics who knew about this, he went to the arts and brought the artists in here to do television, and that was
That's right.
And there's more stories about that than you could ever imagine. How do these people fit into the academic? I mean, they don't have the credentials and all that sort of thing.
We were theater people. We were commercial television people. That's who we were.
Yeah.
And you know.
Now you can imagine the management here of these artists who aren't accustomed to functioning like 8 to 5, 9 to 5 people, and not abiding by few rules, you know, whatever goes. And I'm sitting here as the manager. It was an interesting world I lived in.
I bet it was. My goodness.
But as far as this studio
Yes.
is concerned,
Yes, please.
I walked into here on October the 12th, 1959, and we were supposed to be practicing how we were going to do television when we got the transmitter on the air. Now, the transmitter didn't go on the air until May the 23rd, 1960, 6 o'clock in the evening. Well, we had practiced. We had sought out faculty and brought them over and said, what do you think is important that the people of Georgia should know, and how can we present it? We did a lot of that practice stuff. But on May the 23rd, 1960, all of us who had anything to do with this station were in that control room. And there was a film on the projector, telecine. We signed on, guy in the booth did the announcement with the little slide that said WGTV and all the rest. And we hit the film, and in 15 seconds we had to put the trouble slide up because we lost the loop, and Hill Vermont went out of his gourd.
Customary.
Well, the television station was Hill's life. It was precious to him. And here we made a mistake, so it seemed, within our first 15 seconds. Well, we were all pretty uptight about that.
David did say something that worms in. We did, in continuing education, not just television, but in continuing education, we helped to make the faculty of the University of Georgia have access to the people of Georgia in a different way. Not through the old extension program, that was one day in the corporate extension, but through a new way called continuing education. We did bring in the faculty here. In fact, we converted many faculty members to being community service people rather than staying in the ivory tower. So, and that happened here. It happened around wherever continuing education connected with universities.
What's interesting though about those first days is the only thing, we were only on the air for 4 hours. Most television stations in Atlanta signed on 6:30 in the morning and shut down, well, if they had Jack Parr on that night, it'd be 1 o'clock. And they'd end it with the national anthem, and they'd start it with the national anthem. Well, we came on at 6 o'clock. Why? Well, the only thing we had were films and these television cameras, which required people. So we were live or we were on film, and that was it.
For people who don't know about what television was like then, tell them, if you would please, paint the picture of what it was like to this intricate choreography, this ballet of all these different jobs of audio and title cards and cameras and cues and lighting and everything. What was it like to put on a live television production in that period of time?
Okay, well, the best I remember, it seemed it went like this. We got to work about 8 o'clock in the morning. By 9, we were rehearsing with cameras, audio, film, whatever was going to go in that show. We tried it out here. We had about an hour and a half to rehearse a 30-minute show. And we usually put on 2 live half hours a day. So
In the evening?
In the evening, starting at 6, yeah. Some of the most constant show was called The Growing South. Ronnie Stevens, God rest his soul, was a really attractive representative of the Cooperative Extension Service, and did farm stuff and growing stuff, and they went on every day at 7 o'clock. Between 6 and 7 it was film. 7 o'clock we were live. Then we go to some film, and we had ways of getting films, but it was film, not tape. Nothing that was television. And then about an hour later, we would start another program, and they were either Focal Point. You mentioned Focal Point. That was what was happening within the Georgia Center and presented. Had a show called once a week called In My Opinion, in which a faculty member had been contacted and said, what do you have to say that you think the people of Georgia ought to know from your discipline? And the disciplines ran from English Lit to economics. Later in the procedure, we wound up with about five half hours a week that were all started with the name Picture Window. Why? Picture window on family education, picture window on family recreation, picture window on home building, picture window on, I don't know, a bunch of them. And then, well, that's how we began anyway. That was our first year. And
well, live television took a lot of people, like you said. It really did. It was from it was costly. See, this part of the Georgia Center produced no income. Okay.
Now
you can imagine.
We ate up income.
We ate it up like crazy, and you'll come in a piece of equipment break. You know, where are you going to find the money? And so, not being an income producer, it was. There were trying times, and I don't think you ever did. We did maybe produce a little money sometime, selling something later on, but
I don't know. But after that first year, people began to notice us. Mostly the papers, actually. The newspapers, we didn't have money to put ads in the paper, but they would write reviews. And there was one guy who worked for, I think it was the Journal, could have been the Constitution, who nicknamed the station, called it GG. G-I-G-I. On GG, we saw, and they would tell what he saw, Hill was big on promotion. He was the program director, and he was very big on promotion, so he had good relations, I thought, with the papers. Now, internally, we wish the papers would be more supportive and stuff like that, but I think they really were. Very helpful, considering that they also had 3 commercial stations to deal with in Atlanta. They gave us an extra push, and we didn't have to pay for it.
And there lies the thing. Not only did the papers recognize us, but soon the broadcasters began to recognize us. And as long as we had those movies, they were not movies, by the way, they were old trade things. How do you make lumber? How do you make chocolate? Everybody had those trade things that came out. Okay, you put those on. But when you start on putting on something like a movie, a Hollywood-produced movie, then you saw the Georgia broadcasters come out of the woodworks. Now you're interfering with our business. You're taking our viewers away from us. This is the way we make our money. You're a taxpayer. You get your money from the taxpayer. So stay out of that. And we went through that process of when.
I remember a particular television station that went to the governor.
Yes.
And said, You know what that station ran? It ran a movie with Gina Lollobrigida, and she was hanging out. Well, we ran a movie that was an opera, and Gina Lollobrigida in costume, lip-synced probably, the opera. But it was obviously educational. A commercial television station wouldn't run it in a heartbeat. So the governor said to this particular station, whose numbers I won't give, go fry an egg, or something to that effect. Just get off my back. These guys are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And we had that kind of support for a long, long time.
Yeah, but then we didn't. We get to where
we got to Joe Frank Harris.
Ran into Joe Frank Harris and the Lester Maddox.
Oh my!
People like this that when we got into it, not only showing Rashomon. Okay. How do you take that Japanese film and call it educational? That's the whole point. We had to defend this thing, and what we defended it by, we said, okay, we tried the old sauce, and we have academic freedom. We can do what we think is the best for Georgia. Well, academic freedom didn't fly too high, but when the Georgia broadcasters, and they met their meeting, continuing education, they'd have their meetings here at the Georgia Center, you know. And then, but we get calls from the governor. Anybody that had a 3-cent stamp in those days and a letterhead became program director, you know. And
would cultural be a possible?
Well, we tried. Yeah, it was all it was cultural in many other ways. But when we got into it, and finally we'd had it goes to a bigger fan. Could the Georgia Center sell T-shirts? No, the merchants downtown didn't. Nothing on campus. It's like how long it took the bookstore to sell Georgia coats and things like that with people. It was a conflict of interest in many ways, and we finally got over that. But it took a long time. But and then when Maddox got into it in segregation. See, Alabama educational television in Alabama had been told by Wallace, put no blackface on television. In the background, no blackface, and they had to keep it lily white. Okay, then we come up and Hill Vermont programs. Oh, Stokely Carmichael. Okay, I remember this scene. I remember that opened with a cold opening like this. Stokely's finger in the air like this, and basically saying, "What did you goddamn whites ever do for us?" Now, the phone rang off the thing the next morning. The governor's office. He had a committee of 100. Remember, the committee of 100s were prayed with him every morning. Well, his chairman of the committee of 100.
Lester Maddox.
Yeah, Lester Maddox. Yeah, and he called. The guy wanted to know if it was education. Did Stokely Carmichael say that on television last night? I said yes, and he said, did you program it deliberately? I said yes, we did. He said that's all I wanted to know, that you did it deliberately. Well, we didn't hear much, you know, but then later on, we had to have a meeting in a basement right across from the Howell House in Atlanta on Peachtree Street with Lester Maddox. I was there. Louis Griffith was there, who was the assistant to the president here. And 2 or 3 other people, and a couple of people from the governor's office that I never did quite know who they were. But one named, let me say Blassingame, let's strike that anyway, sat in the back of the room with a fedora on, just sitting there. And we had to show that program, and Lester used phrases, every once in a while he'd spit, like spit this thing out of his, or he would say, you know, you can shoot him with a gun just as easy as you can shoot him with a camera. You can run back into the sea. Like the nastiest things you can say. Well, we sat there, and I wondered where we were going. And then what happened? It happened. We were walking out of there, and I didn't know. Oh, Jack Nix, superintendent of education in state, was there, and one of his assistants. And Jack Nix and the governor and someone walking up one flight of steps. I'm walking up flat like this, you know, this side, and this man with the fedora on. I heard him he reached and got Lester by the elbow and pulled him back and basically said, don't pursue this.
And why was that?
I don't know. I don't know who he was, except he was governor in office, but we never heard another word from Lester Maddox about that. I don't know. It's a mystery to me, but I remember that so vividly. I came back and I told Tom Mailer, who was my boss at that time.
Where was he? Yeah, he was director, wasn't he?
No, he was not director then. Hugh Master was still director.
Oh, he was still?
He was still, Tom was in charge of instruction. But I came back and I told him, I said, this is what happened. And he said, well, we'll just wait and see. But nothing ever happened. But Lester was absolutely out of his gourd that morning, mad and hated the university and all this sort of thing.
So it sounds like the center of gravity kind of shifted, that what the view of what television could be or should be was one thing, and you folks were taking it in another direction to try to be not competitive, but to be a complement. I mean, in order to attract viewers, you had to use which methods to get viewers?
I firmly believed, and I know Hilbermont firmly believed, that television was a gift that could be educational and also entertaining, but could change the culture of this country.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't think we changed the culture of Georgia very much with our efforts, but you know, there was a show on, it was a commercial show called All in the Family. And Norman Lear, who produced that and wrote some of it, I think, did change the culture of this country, and he did it with that technique, with that method, with that medium. And that proves the point, in my judgment.
But that's one show. But the other thing that crept in right at that time was the fact that non-university stations, educational stations, like GBH and the Pittsburgh station, all these things, and in old NET began to produce things that we could use. And, we came in with Fred Rogers in the neighborhood, okay, and then they put on special programs, and they did. I think NET, which is now in its form CPB PBS, it has changed the culture, the expectations of people and what they can watch on television. I think that we.
If you want to drop back a minute to WGTV's role in the national picture.
Yeah, do that.
There were about a half a dozen stations that were selected by NET to produce things nationally. We were one of them. And the reason we were one of them was because of people like Hilbermont.
Because we had a set of artists here. We really did.
And we were really great competitors to KQED, WQED, TTW, NET in New York even. I mean, well, I think it was NET in New York that produced the other side of conscience of a Southern liberal, as opposed to our conscience. Anyway, we were commissioned by the network to do these things. We did regional reports from the Southeast. We were one of the first educational television stations, or non-commercial television stations, to be interconnected nationally, electronically. This is later in the years, but with we were 4 locations, and JCs were selected to be in each section of the country, and they addressed some national problem and how this JC group in Athens would respond to a JC group in San Francisco, and there was some dialogue back and forth. That was not in the beginning, but that's how this station became nationally known, and the University of Georgia became nationally known through this effort.
What was the first program that WGTV produced that went national, that was seen?
Well, if you mean, it depends on how you mean
regional report, I guess.
Yeah, film-wise, we put The Nature of Man out there as soon as we had it.
Yeah, I think they ran those films.
And when NET was run out of Michigan, Ann Arbor, I think. We would submit things up there, and they would bike them around. So I don't know the first program unless it was The Nature of Man.
Yeah.
But the first thing to come out of this studio to go national, I don't know. Might have been a day with Jimmy Driftwood.
But there's another component here that you need to know about. At the same time we built this station here, then the State Department of Education came back and built stations around the state, and we produced the things that were produced here were bicycled. I mean, really, we sent them by courier.
Oh, that's true.
Remember, Hitchcock or somebody like this?
Nelson Hitchcock.
And another boy, Langley, that was in Savannah. We'd ship these big old 2-inch tapes, and they put them on it at the transmitter. You know, that's where. But that came into being, and then one of the other things that NET from the national standpoint is they began to push the envelope of what ought to be on educational television, so much so that somewhere back, I wish I knew the date, we had a grand meeting of all of us in Washington where we were presented the idea of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and public television came in, and with that one meeting we changed from educational television to public television, which was a big move.
And do you think the time was right in the country to do that? Because as I recall, and from seeing some of the programs, the civil rights movement was ongoing, and it seemed that NET and public television were in some ways leading the way in reporting that.
We were. In fact, we covered when KQED covered the riots in Los Angeles. It has a name.
The Watts?
Watts riots. The Watts riots was covered. We put that on. It really did heat up the mail and everything around this country and around here. Why are you doing that? You're trying to incite. You incite. Okay, and so there's not. If you go back and look at the history of these years with WGTV, it reflected nearly every one of the big things that went on in society, you know. But that was one, and then by that time, what was being produced for public consumption, we got into not just a movie, but you got an X, an R, and a G, and a PG, and all this sort of thing. So what do you put on television? Okay, and I guess old Rushbond would have been at least R, wouldn't it? When you
I don't
put that,
know.
yeah.
I remember we didn't produce it, but we got it from public television sources.
The first color program we ever did here was a national program. Mm-hmm. Interconnected. It was called Putchaman Terrace, Peace on Earth. It was Sunday afternoon, and it was a grand thing. It had the Pope and all this, and it was just one of these let's love each other sort of thing, you know. But it was the first color thing we did here, and that's when O.C. Adderhole said to Tom Mailer, "Why can't we do color all the time?" And then from that, then we get into another round of where's your money come from?
Exactly.
Okay.
So as a producer, as a director, as a manager, how did you balance the incite versus investigate? How did you lead the way or help facilitate investigations about various things in society, which that was a great period of change and turmoil, and yet balance it and not become too much, not go over the top?
We sought grants to produce things. This cluster of geniuses we brought in here into the university to do this had a national reputation, and they would they'd call and know if we would do this. When Thomas Altizer at Emory University announced that God is dead, okay, then NET called us and wanted to know if we would consider covering that because he is there. And we said, yes, we need a little money. I think he gave us $2,000, something like this. Then David Fisher produced a program called God is Dead, and it went national. It went all over. It was a film. You did that on film, not television.
It was filmed.
Yeah, good film, and it's still around. In fact, I must say this: in the last 2 years, Thomas Altizer called me, and still alive. He teaches somewhere up in Pennsylvania, and wanted to know if I remembered that film. He never had seen it. And David, we just happened to have a copy of it. I sent him a DVD of this, and the man, I think, goes ape from now on. He shows it all over the country, everywhere he goes to lecture, because it's the best summary of what happened to him at Emory. And that was a challenging thing for Emory to go through, and we were right there covering it. David wrote the script, interviewed all those people, and it was a thing. But that was because we had the reputation of being able to produce it. NET asked us to do it, and we did it.
That was a fine piece of work, I will admit that. We interviewed the president of Emory. Said, why don't you fire this guy? He's saying God is dead. You're a Christian organization. And we know we've got these people. We filmed these people who's calling you to fire him. He sat there and he said, there's no reason to fire the man. He has done no moral turpitude or whatever that is. He didn't do this. He's a great teacher. There's no reason to fire him. We went to the Archbishop of the Roman Catholic Church, interviewed him. He said, well, I think he's got a point here. I think we ought to really listen to Tom Altizer. Then we went to a Baptist church.
Thomas Haggai.
Well, I'm thinking about a different one, over in Marietta. The guy said, Thomas Altizer has something to say to us. Then, yeah, we did do Haggai. Well, he did the show for us. He said, the God is Dead Brigade is... He went into his preacher mode, you know. And, anyway, it's all there on that film. It's nicely done.
That film did something from Emory. See, when it picked up, this film and other things were picked up, the Times, New York Times, equated Emory to the Harvard of the South.
The Harvard of the South.
Because of this academic freedom, the president would not. He went along with it, and it was back to your point.
Yeah.
We produced those things because they were good, and we could do it. But for some reason we had the money because continuing education was rolling in all that money. We spent it for them.
But I'll tell you the truth. We heard about Thomas Altizer because he made the cover of Time magazine.
Yeah.
And because Walter Cronkite put it on his news show, this incredible idea that these two guys, there were two guys, Thomas Altizer and another guy. What's his name? Started with a name?
Hamilton, Indiana.
They're Christian atheists. How could you be that?
Well, when the headlines
that's just too. That's
and
just
in
too,
the South too.
Yeah, that's just too close.
The Atlanta Journal interviewed Billy Graham. He got off a plane in Atlanta at the airport, and some guy said, "What about God is dead? He can't be dead. I talked to him a while ago." You know, that kind of thing got into it.
Yeah. Now, looking back, do you think that the university knew that WGTV and that TV station would change the center of gravity and contribute to the dialogue in the state? Do you think they realized that, or do you think they were still thinking of it as classroom education distributed?
I'd say it's about 40, 60.
It really depends on who the top administration happened to be at the time. There was, O.C. Adderhole had a love for this station. What he couldn't abide by, and I got more phone calls about this, Hill, Vermont would interrupt programs with what's coming up. And O.C. didn't like that. We don't interrupt, just do it at the end, which is a pretty good pattern. But no, I don't think, and then Fred Davison had a great admiration for it. And the deanships varied. When Dean Drury left and the new dean came in, he had been a journalist, I've forgotten his name. He came and sat down. We had some real fine conversations with him about some things we could do. We did hire journalism students, you know, to work here, but not just them solely. Anybody wanted a job, like Bill Evelyn. I don't know where he came from, out of some woods, you know.
I came from Walton County.
But I must tell this yarn because it's germane to something. I was not much in the loop of things like Hill Vermont was, but one day I walked down the hall and Hill said, "What you got up for the day? Could I see you?" I said, "Well, yeah, I told you this morning, but this afternoon I got an appointment. Mr. Turner's coming to see me," and he said, "Oh, yeah, okay." I said, "What's his name?" I said, "I think my secretary said he's Ted Turner." He said, "Yeah, and at 4 o'clock I'm meeting the President of the United States. Ted Turner's not coming over here." Ted Turner came into my office at 2 o'clock that afternoon with Norman Underwood, who later ran for governor and was connected with this station because his wife had worked back here.
Well, Norman announced at one time.
Yeah. And a guy named Johnson was there, and then some guy, I never did know who he was.
Johnson, maybe.
He might have been, and another guy sat there. He was a finance man, sat there almost like the guy with the fedora on, but and then I was there, and Ted Turner basically made this proposition: I would like to swap my channel 17 for channel 8. And what I'll do is I'll go downtown Atlanta and we'll build the highest tower with all the whistles on it that the FAA will let us build, and we'll colorize this studio, colorize here. We'll put you in business, and we'll swap.
We put both towers on the both 17 and 8.
17 on there.
Downtown.
And we could have 17. We'd have 17 just like this all over. And he said, and we had to talk about everything. He loved this station because his children, 6 of them, had been watching cartoons we put on early in the morning. You know, Sesame Street.
5 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah. And one time he said, "You think I can get the Sesame Street for my channel?" I said, "I don't know. We work at it, you know." But anyway, it went on, and he said, talked about the amounts of money. He was talking about $50,000 and do this. And every time he'd say something, the finance man would squirm, and Norm would wonder what's going on here. And it ended this way. He basically said, "Would you consider this at all?" I said, "No, sir, I wouldn't."
Why did you not consider it?
Because I felt like the university needed a VHF channel, because in those days UHF there were second cousins, third, fourth cousins. You couldn't get out of the signal. Now, I can write into this drama more than is there, but I've said this. He said, would you want to do this? I said, "No, sir, I would not want to do this." And he thanked me. And as he headed out, I did have the moxie, I think, to say to him, "Mr. Turner, I'm the station manager here. There are people you need to talk to. You could talk to the director of the center, you could talk to the president, you could talk to the regents about your question." He said, "But you don't want to do it, do you?" I said, "No, sir." We never heard another word from Ted Turner about that. But now, did we create the superstation? He couldn't have his V, so he went national. Now that's just speculation, something I'd like to think.
But satellites came along.
It does make sense. So in a way, you can take a little bit of credit for helping launch.
Well, I have all over the country, and you know, in good time. Yeah, I took advantage of that.
I had heard
but with that being the case, the university did need the station, and I think it proved through the years. But could I interject one thing here? All along we was doing public television. In my office, I seemed to get I was the lightning rod. Everybody who drove through Georgia, out of North Carolina, Alabama, they went this way with public radio. We'd drive into darkness. All of a sudden, no public radio through Travis. And they'd call university, and I fielded more of those questions about why we don't have public radio. And I put a notebook up in my office one day called The Dream. And for about 5 or 6 years, in the annual request or annual report, I wrote in the need for public radio, and never was funded. You know, never was going. It just wasn't funded. And then the thing that happened is that the second big Kellogg grant, that by the way was going to have an additional studio, bigger than this one, back out here someplace.
20 feet.
Yeah, big thing. And but again, I think that enticed Kellogg to give us a grant that built the Hugh Masters Hall, the big hall here. It went through the whole renovation here, added rooms and all that sort of thing. And all that happened from about 1984 up to 88, something like this. And then we did get the radio station. We got the radio station put in. And it was one of my last acts in this place was sometime in October of '87. I switched the button and put on public radio, and not that I did it because I helped write the grant.
But by that time, Channel 8 was no longer the University of Georgia's television station.
And before I cover that, because that was a momentous thing, one of the terms that's synonymous with public television is funding. We're all, of course, all familiar with funding drives and pledge drives and so on. Funding is always a challenge, always an issue. Please tell our audience how you were able to balance those, having the freedom to academically and intellectually pursue topics that maybe commercial television didn't, but at the same time dealing with the perpetual funding limitations.
Put it this way, the budget for the communications division was funded by the general budget of the Georgia Center. And we were, in fact, we spent right at $200,000 a year programming and all the things that go with it from Georgia Center funds created by conferences, okay? But then that changed when Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a funder, okay, they fund public PBS, okay,
and now Public, funds
they fund that, and at that point they began to make through PBS to us, all stations got a community service grant, and with that that's the program money. Okay, here's another place where the federal government saw something that needed to be done and did it. Okay, and so we got the public community service grant of around $400,000 a year, but we had to spend it by buying from their catalog, and all the stations, anybody could put something in the catalog, and you buy it. And the biggest time we had, the most fun I ever had with Hill, Vermont, was sitting down and looking at, when the catalog came out, what can we afford? Some things we couldn't afford, and some. And Hill told me later that he appreciated my generosity. He said one time, the money wasn't mine, you know, it was my generosity, because I didn't know what he was buying, you know. He was the artist, he was the entertainer, and I'd say, sounds good to me, sounds good to me. So we spend that amount of money for programming back to it. Then when the State Department of Education decided it would go public broadcasting, it would have its own programming. We'd had WABA in Atlanta, the Atlanta television station. They decided they wanted to go public broadcasting too. We had been paying them. No, they had been paying us. No, that's good. We'd been paying them about $200,000, $210,000 a year to run our programming. All of a sudden, they decided to run their own program, so we ended up with a large S of some more money to spend. So for the last 6 or 7 years, we were flush with money, not much of it from the Georgia Center then, And so we became a little more fair-haired child, and the thing, not the stepchild down the hall spending all our money. We were used at times. I must say this about from the university standpoint. Now, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
It seems like every May or June the university had to spend its money, and the people had money left all over the campus and put it in pots. And I've had this happen a couple of times. Somebody run down the hall from accounting and say, "Can you take care of $75,000 before tomorrow?" And they knew we could because we buy one camera or buy tubes. All this, we do it. So we did. We lived off of the surplus. Wouldn't go back.
Used to say we lived off the turnstiles of the Georgia Center.
That's right. Yeah.
That's what we used to say.
Yeah.
I'm glad you confirmed that, because I remember being in the studio and John Packwood coming in and saying that we had to perpetually have equipment lists ready to go that we could pull out and give to you to say, here's tripods and equipment, because literally it would have to be in 24 hours. We'd have to make purchases.
And you'd have to have the data.
Exactly, and from the manufacturers and so on. Now, in commercial programming, they have a feedback system whereby they have ratings, they have advertisers, and therefore revenue. If they're doing a good job, if they're making entertaining programming, they'll know about it in very short order. But with public television, I gathered from your earlier comments that if people had complaints, you'd hear about them very quickly. What about compliments? Did you get compliments anywhere like in the ratio that you did with complaints?
Yes, and it came in different ways. You know, when you were out traveling around someplace, and you mentioned University's Channel 8, people appreciated it. But I don't know that
we've got Nielsen ratings.
Yeah,
they were never as much as the 3 channels in Atlanta, but they made a mark. I mean, they were, 8, 10. We were always distressed by the fact that we weren't bigger and more appreciated, or appreciated as much as we thought we should be. But we did get Nielsen ratings. We watched them as closely as, I think, not as closely, because our budget didn't depend on it. Mm-hmm. How much you charge for a commercial depends on your rating, if you're a commercial station. We didn't have that problem. But we really did want to reach out, and we wanted people to watch us. And we spent a good deal of effort. God, Ed Graham spent a lot of effort trying to be sure that our signal was as good as, and it wasn't when the transmitter was on Jacks Creek Mountain, as good as it could possibly be and reach as far into the Atlanta metropolis as possible. Once we put it on Stone Mountain, well, there we were almost as good as any commercial channel in town in terms of reception.
And that was not without its problem.
I would like to hear about that, because I will tell you that a personal story. My first visit here was 1976 in my high school independent study class, where I was already working at a local cable TV station. We were television people in progress. But Ed Graham gave us a tour, and in the film room he put up a film which he had shot, or had asked to be shot, of the transmitter being on a flatbed truck, being hoisted, winched up the side, the eastern side, the steep side of Stone Mountain. That's right. Why was the transmitter located at Jacks Creek in Walton County first, and then what was the impetus to finally move it to Stone Mountain?
There was a license in Alabama, I've forgotten which town, where they had a license for Channel 8. And the charts showed that it would cover here. Our Channel 8 would interfere with theirs if we got it any closer to Atlanta. They finally gave it up and didn't put up their Channel 8 in Alabama, wherever it was, whatever city it was. We then could go to Stone Mountain and cover Atlanta, because we no longer had an interference on the western side of Georgia and the eastern side of Alabama on Channel 8.
And since the Atlanta's school channel was a UHF, it gave them no problem with us moving that close. That's technically, it gave them a little problem us moving in too close to the market. Yeah.
Wgtv. Now, I understand that, and those are good, solid reasons for moving that from a technical standpoint. But who did you have to deal with at the state level because obviously there were no commercial transmitters allowed on Stone Mountain, which is a state park or a state entity. And yet, being a public television station, you were probably the only candidates who could have even been considered to be sited there.
Correct.
I remember more about the problem we had with getting the construction permit and getting it signed off. By that time, the governor had appointed a telecommunications commission, which would later turn out to be our nemesis, because that would be the group that Joe Frank Harris, by decree from the governor, took Channel 8 away from the University of Georgia and gave it to the State Department of Education. And we became
the Telecommunications Commission.
Yeah, the telecommunications. But now, for the reasons, I don't know why, unless it had been a dream of Ed Graham's a long time to do that, or Hill Vermont.
I think our local legislators, Hugh Logan was one. They went over to the state, at the state house, and they, through some political mechanism, got the restrictions on Stone Mountain waived because it was the University of Georgia's transmitter.
And they already had built a building on top. See, the purist who didn't want anything on the stone, okay?
Yeah,
they'd already built a restaurant on
It was like
top.
a visitor center.
Yeah,
so there was
like on
something
top
up
of
there,
it.
and they also were. We were up there before the skylift thing happened.
Yeah.
As you said, you saw pictures of it going up the eastern side of the mountain.
Now one of the other Stone Mountain stories is the Carving Stone Mountain, a film that David made, which was a monumental. That thing is still worthy of watching, because you see the old technique. It's not old technique. They still use that same technique around mountains now. Not quite as primitive, but that Carving the Stone Mountain was that our idea that we sold to somebody else, or was that?
We went to What's New, which
What's New?
What's New is a network program. All the channel, all educational, non-commercial stations could access. It was What's New was a series that it was almost from the beginning, out of Chicago. We put several programs in there, but we did put the Carving of Stone Mountain in there.
And also
I remember getting up. We filmed it in May, and the first time I went up there, I thought I was going to lose it.
May of what year?
Yeah, I would say
70.
66, 67. It was where the carving was not complete. The three heads were there. Where we were up there, they were doing one of the generals, one of the figures' hand. And what we filmed was the development of that hand on the mountain. But we went up on an elevator, one of these construction elevators, to a house that was up on kind of like a battleship gangplank up there. And it was scary. And then we walk across this huge walkway that was on I-beams stuck into the mountains. And then down two of the longest ladders, lashed together, I've ever been on, down to a swinging bunch of scaffolding, covered, some of it covered by canvas, because in May, the winds were, it was cold. We had jet burners, the heat in there. But I swear, I would drive over to Stone Mountain, 6 o'clock in the morning and say, well, this is the day I'm going to die. I'm going to fall off that mountain.
Who shot it for you? Who was the cinematographer on that?
Gosh, Peter Hudson was one of them. Packwood was there, I think. I'm pretty sure. But Peter Hudson did some of the really gutsy stuff. It was the first time I ever used a wireless mic. It was a Vega, that big. And I remember I had at least 2 camera shots. I think it was 3 camera shots on one of the times he was going to drill. It was to see the driller, or he was not drilling. He was drilling in this instance, because they would drill so many inches in and then they'd blow the rock off with a torch. I think I had 3 cameras on it. and the guy had a wireless mic, and he was going to tell us what he was doing and why he was doing. He was marking, and he was going to drill. And I said, roll him, and go.
The sculptor of that, by the way, used that film when he opened up a tourist thing near Stone Mountain, and had laid out all the equipment and everything, and he came, and we gave him permission to use the film in his it didn't work as a tourist place, but
back to my story. I've
Okay.
got 3 cameras out here,
Okay.
a wireless mic, first time we ever used it. I say, roll it, the guy does his thing, it's about a 3-minute take, and I say, okay, cut. And Peter says, ready when you are, CB. Also, he took Peter Hudson took a step backward. We were standing here, he's standing here drinking coffee on a little piece of a break. He takes a step backward, and that's a 2x4. Or no, maybe it's a 4x4, I don't know, but it's a big plank. He steps down, and for 2 inches he thinks he's going down that mountain. I've never seen anybody turn as white. He was sure he was gone. That's how scary it was. But my future wife at that point was Carol McDonald, and she got permission to go up there. That's why I know it was 60-something there. She got permission to go up there with us one day, and I've got pictures of her standing in the mouth of the horse. Pictures of her on the mountain. And as far as I know, she's the only woman that was ever on that particular carving. The earlier carvings, they had parties. But this carving, I don't think anybody else has been up.
he mentioned what's new. Hill, Vermont also, we granted the funds internally for him to go to Bikini Atoll to do 25 years after Hiroshima.
Yeah, but that wasn't What's New, was it, Bill?
I thought it went into the What's New.
No, What's New was a program designed for kids 10 to 13.
Or was okay. Anyway, he took a film crew to.
We went to the
Bikini Atoll.
we went to the whole Micronesia. We went to Micronesia, did the 5 basic islands there. But the reason that we went there, this is a jump.
Yeah.
In terms of what happened when, but we went there to witness and film the Bikinians returning to the island of Bikini. They had been persuaded, very ugly part of our history. They'd been persuaded by a Navy admiral at the request of the president, whoever it was at that time, to let the Bikinians to move to an island. We'll take them to an island, and we'll support them because we want to blow up their island. And we want to do it for the good of all mankind because we have this very dangerous weapon. And we want, anyway, you remember the story about how we got the Bikinians off of the island and what we did when they got off. Well, we wanted to witness them coming back after the island had been cleaned and little bungalow houses had been built there where before it had been grass huts and beautiful stuff, and it was pretty ugly. And we did that. And since we were in Micronesia, we did another thing called That Uncertain Paradise.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And anyway, that was a fun trip, and I think we were in Micronesia for about 6-7 weeks.
And all these programs were shown nationally when they came out.
Well, yeah, Hill got a Robert
awards.
Kennedy Award, and he was touted. The film was shown. He was touted at the Kennedy place, the Kennedy Center, in Washington.
Hill told me in 2007 when I visited him to invite him to come to the reunion, he talked about that, and he said that there were all these, when the Bikinians were going to be allowed back, all these organizations around the world, BBC and everybody, wanted to be there to witness it. And he said that the University of Georgia, being a university, research and education and so on, had a better chance of presenting what I guess the government would have felt was a balanced view of that episode than some other news organizations. So that was one time where the university's academic credentials brought it to the head of the line, as it were. What I'd like to do is to cover 3 programs that are in the 60s, because I want to make sure, because these apparently are pretty good ones. Please tell me about Nature of Man, Jimmy Driftwood, and then Eiffel Tower. And I've got clips for the last 2. But what was the Nature of Man? How did it come about through the Ford Foundation? And how did it be done here at the University of Georgia?
All right. The way I understand it, it worked like this. First of all, Fund for Adult Education and Kellogg Foundation are, good buddies. And when the Georgia Center when the University of Georgia got the Kellogg grant to build the Georgia Center, Jerry Oppie and Hill Vermont got the idea to make that series. And the idea was that they would have scholars here on campus write a book. Like, what's the nature of man? What is the moral dilemma? I think there are 6 volumes.
6 volumes, yes.
And from those 6 volumes, 2 films were made. What is Art, for example, became on film Pegasus Without Wings. What is the Nature of Man became The Nature of Man, which was filmed in Mexico. You showed a little bit of that a moment ago. But anyway, it was a project that lasted at least 3 years before it was finally completed, and Hill wrote at least half of those films. But professors had on campus here, from Franklin College for the most part, wrote little booklets, 100 pages or so, on what the basic issue was. And so that's how that came.
And in a cooperative way, the films were done here. The books were a product of the instructional division of the Georgia Center. Tom Mailer was the editor.
That's right.
Yeah, Tom Mailer was the editor. And that was the Ford Foundation got into the act some way by wanting us to evaluate. Okay, here they are, you've done this, now evaluate these films some way.
They funded it.
They funded it, yeah. They funded
the production.
Production, yes, yeah. And then they wanted to evaluate it. And that's the first time I ever heard of the Georgia Center. When,
you were an evaluator.
No, I was going to be hired as an evaluator, and I found out I didn't have credentials as a sociologist, so he hired somebody else. And I came later as supervisor of conferences here, something like that. And that's when I met this crowd.
Well, I was struck by the fact in looking at Nature of Man that it was very heavyweight intellectual content for any age, particularly 50 years ago. Was that the nature of those kind of programming in those days, or was that exceptional?
That's exceptional.
It's an oddity. It's
brilliant. That series is brilliant. It's the only one of the first, of course, because it was before the television station had a transmitter. But we paid actors from Atlanta to come in here and do some of those roles. They were dramatic scripts written based on this intellectual material. And various people wrote them, but I think Hill wrote most of them. Charles Josie wrote Pegasus Without Wings. That I know, he may have written another one. Oliver Land plays in some of them. I'm not sure that Oliver ever wrote any. I'd have to go look at the series again to see who wrote them, but they were written by people who were working for WGTV and the Georgia Center.
And those programs, by the way, were not just television. They traveled around the state with conference groups at universities. The Georgia Center would send a coordinator and a couple of people down, professors, and do this. I remember one time Fred Davidson had his whole staff in from the College of Vet Medicine to go through the basic issues of man as a continuing education thing. But that was, I think the Georgia Center and the TV station and the film people put its best foot forward at that moment, and it never lifted it again. I mean, it stayed high from then on.
Now, on a lighter vein, I was surprised to learn in my research that this station, a local television station produced its own cartoon. Tell me the story of Larkspur and the Colonel.
Larkspur and the Colonel. Larkspur and the Colonel was, I think it was largely the idea of Charles Josie. I know Charles Josie wrote at least 100 of them. And we just didn't want our standard station break. You know, between shows, commercial stations put in commercials. We just have promotions. We want you to watch the next program. And so our station breaks, many of them, for the first 2 or 3 years, were Larkspur and the Colonel. Larkspur was a dog. The Colonel was a southern, very southern colonel. And the Colonel would talk to Larkspur about what he wanted to do tonight. He wanted to watch Focal Point, or he wanted to watch Picture Window on Family Education, because it was so good. And the dog would howl back sometimes.
WGTV presents The Pride of the South, Larkspur and the Colonel.
I say, Larkspur, you had better get out of that flower bed faster than a thoroughbred running at the Kentucky Derby.
And a guy here named Byron Warner did a lot of the tracks, who was the son of the 2 people who taught opera here in the music department. He could really do some things with his voice, which made them very attractive. And I think if there'd have been some sort of competitive thing where we could have put in for station breaks, I think we'd have won a grand prize for Larkspur and the Colonel. And I often long to hear that voice again. I was so glad when you played it a minute ago, because I have thought about that. Those were great station breaks.
When I met with Charles Josie, actually for a couple of times for lunch, and he related that story, he had a cell. The cell you saw there was apparently the only one left. It was framed in his house.
Yeah, we had usually 10.
Really? But as far as he knew, that was the only one still around. The audio he thought was lost, but he was doing some clean out, and he found 3 reels of it. And I've managed to transfer the first of the reels, but I will get in addition to you in the future.
I am so glad you found that.
Yes, because your voice is on some of them.
Could
as
be.
the introduction.
Could be. I don't know.
Now, was it true that WGTV was the first station in Georgia to have a female announcer?
Yes, absolutely true.
Shirley Slater.
Shirley Slater.
Yeah.
And how did that decision come to do that?
Hilbermott thought that it would be better. It would attract people. Hilbermott's idea. And we had a good female announcer. And people responded to it, and even the commercial stations responded to it pretty quickly.
I remember my family moved from Miami to Georgia in 1970, so for 9 years before I started working here, I was one of your viewers. I watched the Masterpiece Theaters, the Nova shows, and so on.
Did you ever see I, Claudius?
Yes. Yes.
That got some reaction from our television friends.
I bet it did. But one of the things I remember was the voice of Carol Fisher, I think was.
Yes,
I knew her at that time.
She was our announcer.
But the other voice was George Montiel.
Yes.
And it was surreal in setting up the 2007 reunion. I got his phone number. I called him, and because I had to leave a message, so he calls back, and it's like, here's the voice of Channel 8 talking to me.
Exactly. He was the voice of Channel 8 for a long time.
It was
for about
amazing.
4 or 5 years anyway.
Yes, and it really felt like family. Please tell us about the 2 shows, the Jimmy Driftwood and the Eiffel Tower show. And I guess to start off with saying, you must have gone through lots of ideas for your show candidates, and obviously there was some selection process. Why is it that those 2, what put them over the top to saying, yes, we should do these as shows?
Dr. Masters knew Jimmy Driftwood, and he said, he said to Jerry Oppie, I think, that was before your time,
Before my time, yeah.
Yeah, he said to Jerry, he said, I want to get him in here, and I want you to televise him, make tapes. We had a tape recorder by then. And I want you to call it A Day with Jimmy Driftwood. Well, Jerry tells Hill calls me. I said, who the hell is Jimmy Driftwood? He's a friend of Dr. Masters, and he's a singer and a composer and so on. Well, I looked it up and researched a little bit and found out a little bit about Jimmy Driftwood. And I don't think I ever had any contact with him till he got here.
Masters and Mailer did the contact.
Oh, yeah, but I didn't, as a producer, director of his being here, I never talked to the man until he got here.
Yeah.
And he said, well, what do you want me to do? And we said, well, we want you to do a performance in what is now Masters Hall. But other than that, we would like you to go talk to to students in the music school, and we would like you to do a master class in the studio. I must have had some pretty because I had lined up people to be in the master class. I'd arranged for him to do it. But anyway, we shot him getting off the airplane. Take him to the music school. He spent the morning there, essentially doing a master class. But he was in a classroom and he was showing off, and students were asking him questions. And I think I don't remember that one too well. The second one was shot here in this studio, and it was around a table, and we had about 4 or 5. I remember Virginia Shield was one who was a guitarist, but it was guitar and banjo type things. I don't think there was any other stuff, but they would play for him. He would criticize what they had done, or make suggestions, or say it was great. And then they'd play together, and then they'd go to the next one. It was about 4 or 5 students. That took a half hour. I mean, we made a half-hour show out of it. And then that evening, the campus had been invited by Dr. Masters to come to this auditorium and see Jimmy Driftwood at X hour, whatever it was, probably 8. And we positioned the 3 cameras. We had 3 cameras. That's all we ever had, I think, was 3 cameras. But we put the cameras out there and let him go. And taped that. And then he said bye-bye. Went back to Arkansas, where he started out as a school teacher for kids, under 8th grade usually, but sometimes 2 or 3 grades in one room. And he was really distressed that he couldn't get those kids to understand the difference between the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the War of 1860, the Civil War. So that's where that little song that leads off there comes from.
Battle of New Orleans.
Battle of New Orleans, yeah. Something about an alligator in it.
Well, then, how did the University of Georgia and WGTV get to the Eiffel Tower as far as a TV show? How did that come about?
I think Dr. Hale can answer that better than I do. Better than I can. I was told that we were going to do it, and to go to Atlanta and deal with the dramatic director there, and Chris Manos, and talk to them about what they had in mind. As I understand it, there was a grant involved in the making of this thing. The music was a composition by a lady whose name I've forgotten, and that composition won a contest somewhere and gave funding. But anyway, the soundtrack has got a lot of crazy music in it, and this woman wrote it. So it was done to show that particular thing off, the grant for the music and everything else. And Chris Manos grabbed hold of it and really wanted to push it. And he got a hold of Michael Howard and a very famous dance woman, whose name escapes me, who came down and did some of the choreography, because there's a good bit of choreography in it. And I went over to Atlanta probably for a period of about 10 days every day and watched what they were doing and tried to figure out what I was going to do with it. Had the script. We cut it up in about, my guess is about 10 pieces. For example, there's a place in it where there's a dining table and it changes shapes and it gets bigger, and so on. Each one of those was a little section. And we we'd only be able to shoot in corners of the studio, but we never really got the full panorama. But the whole studio had a cyc around it with a drawing of what it would look like from the second floor of the Eiffel Tower. And it's Jean Cocteau's piece, which is kind of interesting. The best line in the show, in my judgment, is when this whole wedding party is lined up and they take a picture of it, and he's trying to sell it to an art dealer, and he said, "How much?" And he pulls out, lots of zeros on the card to tell him what it was. He said, "But it's unsigned." I said, "Of course it's unsigned. It's painting by God. God does not sign." Is in there someplace, if I remember it correctly.
And the back of the card says sold.
Yes, that's right. It says, he turns flips
I
it
am
card.
relatively new at this time, all right?
Yeah.
This must be within the first, when was that done?
64 or 5.
65, I think, was the date that I...
Okay, it's 64.
I'd been at the center 2 years upstairs, okay, and then this is probably within the first year of my, anyway, I think I got to preside over the most bizarre thing that ever happened at any university in the time, and it went on and on and on, and I had to be here to protect protect the rest
property.
of the center, because they were using dressing rooms, offices and dressing rooms back here, and all that, and coming down costume to eat, sometimes,
right.
and I was here. I like presiding over a three-ring circus all the time, and knowing that money is flying out the window, But we did. There was a grant. Tom Mailer was actually instrumental in getting the grant from somebody. I don't know who underwrote that. It was not on the credits.
But it did start with that woman who wrote the music.
Yeah.
And she was a really great sport, because we
been
mangled a number of times.
This station's history, as I was here, was always subject to who knew who where. Things people would show up here like we never knew Sylvan Meyer. People might know about it, but Hill runs into Sylvan Meyer, one of the tremendous journalists of all time, I think. And then the first thing we're doing shows with him. Then it just seemed to happen that way. And when we began to do all kinds of things, we did 10 Thanksgiving Sunday evenings after Thanksgiving in the Coliseum called the Community Christmas Celebration.
Yes, I worked on some of those.
Okay, and
we both.
and those came about because Pierce Arant, who was a good old South Carolina boy and a friend of mine, came over. We were chatting one day at lunch, and I began to tell him about the greatest choral experience I ever had as a 6th grader in Greenville, South Carolina, when the Textile Hall, when they had 1,000 voices from the schools with an orchestra doing a great piece. We did Mendelssohn's Redemption or something like this, and we were none of us could read it. But anyway, I remember that experience. I said, I've always wanted to hear that again. He said, we might could do that. And from that moment, we began to design this thing of having that happen. By the way, the community service grant that came from PBS had $20,000 every year written in that something would not occur. You did not have to spend it on programming, but spend it on the local community. So we took $20,000, and I knew that we had some problems in paying people like the orchestra, so I went to the mayor of Athens, Upshaw Bentley, and asked him if he'd pay the faculty. I couldn't pay the faculty, one of those things, but he could. So he gave us $4,000 to pay the orchestra, and that went nationwide for 10 years. You directed 2 or 3 of those.
Pasquale directed 2 or 3. I directed.
And they are still by the way, they're still played. Do you know this? They're still played on Christmas Day.
But I thought you were going to get into the arguments that we had with the music department.
Oh.
About once Pierce wasn't in it.
Oh yeah.
Pierce was the conductor to start with, but then, oh my Lord, whether Thomas Weaver was going to direct it or whether John was going.
John Carina.
Yes. Oh.
But we got Here I am. I ran into the prima donnas at the music school on what to do, because I was paying Pierce. I could pay him under faculty regulations. I could pay him to do all the work he did, and it all happened out of my office with Vicki Butler there as the kind of coordinator of things, and we got the choir there, and I remember the first night we were supposed to have 1,000 voices there, and it set the stage up, lighted all this, and about 5 o'clock that afternoon, we didn't have them all there, and and Mike Pasquale came and he said, cover up. So we covered up seats with black on the east side. It didn't look like there was an empty place. But no.
Toward the end of that series, our remote truck was not adequate, and we started getting ETVs. Remote truck.
It came over here, yeah.
And it was fun to work out of that truck. It really was. It was so much better than ours. But they had the money.
I have those. I have all those, and I'll say this in David's presence, and the other guys. I understand the others did a good job, but David, the 2 shows you produced or directed, Pierce Arant told me that was he was so proud of that, because you kept the camera on him a lot, would cut, and you put the camera back in the orchestra someplace. Anyway, it really showed the thing and showed the audience. It was Pierce's favorite.
Well, I never knew that, Bill.
Yeah,
I'm glad
he
he liked it.
He did like, except for one thing.
Oh.
When he heard the thing on the next night, when we heard it on, we put it on maybe a Tuesday night or something like this, Pierce would come over with tears in his eyes, and he said, well, why do you have to take my sound and balance everything? He said, you make all the sound the same on TV. Why can't you let it be like the music?
It's called a limiter, as I recall.
Yes. And the FCC has something to
and
say
he loved
about
to hold notes with the choir as long as it had breath, and fade out, and it never did fade out. It kept.
Yes. Now I know that there's the tendency to romanticize the past, but it really seems like WGTV hit its stride in that period, the first, let's say, 20 years. Yeah. Would you agree? Do you have comments on that?
It became more and more a financial liability to the Georgia Center, and we had cutbacks in staff, and it was not so easy to approve things. I got to where at first I was just nilly-willy. The thing, if you wanted to do it, how much? I didn't ask how much. Just go do it. If Hill wanted to go to Afghanistan, go to Afghanistan. Bring back a film or something like this. Or go to Israel. You went to Israel, didn't you? Go to Israel.
Sure did.
Anyway, but
did 2 films there.
I think the thing that helped it get over, Hugh Masters set the tone for it. Then Tom Mailer really loved what was done back here in this.
They both loved this television.
They loved the they really did. Right. And then when it became.
But did the university love it as well, or had it become as much of a burden because of the financial and sometimes the political baggage?
Political. I sat in the office, a government office, one morning with Lee Franks, who was director of educational television, part of it, and Culver Kidd and a couple other people. And Culver Kidd simply said, "Now, I'll tell you right now, the only thing that station is good for is to put on the legislative." When we're in legislature, repeat the legislature. That's all. It's all good. You don't need to have it on. Just have it on. That was from a politician. Okay, but we had a problem. And when it came down that the station was going to move, the university tried to fight it. In fact, I got myself in a real noose about that because a vice president came to me one day and said, turn your staff loose on members of the legislature. Tell them to call them, get in their hair, get in their face, and we won't keep this station here. Well, Hill Vermont hit the Atlanta Road, and 2 other people, a couple other ways, and it all backfired. all backfired on us, you know, and then that vice president crumbled under the heat, you know, and we went through turmoil, and I think that we're going to lose the station because the state Department of Education wanted it. Jack Nix wanted it, and he hired Lee Franks.
Well, I think the reason we lost the station was because it was a good station.
Good station. Somebody wanted it.
We had an audience, and it was identifiable. The other people didn't. How many people in Savannah watched Channel 9? At least Channel 8 was picking up an audience, and it did, occasionally at least, exciting programming. And I think we would have lost it anyway, because about the time we lost it, and it went to Atlanta to the Telecommunications Commission by governor edict, there were becoming a lot of television stations. Cable came in, and suddenly you can get 100 channels, and a lot of those channels were doing a lot of stuff that we were doing. So Channel 8 is no longer what it was. Channel 8 now is another station.
Public broadcasting.
It's another station. Non-commercial? Don't tell me that.
The last four nights.
But the other thing is, we did our bit, and time and innovation in the market, the ability to get 100 channels in your home, made us very much not a consequence anymore, the way we had been. When we were one of 4 stations they could get in the number 13 market.
Alternative without commercials.
We were thriving, and people liked it. But now the competition is so fierce that I'm glad I'm out of it. I'm glad I don't have to compete in it anymore. I still wish I could do some things, but I don't think that universities anymore need television channels. I did think they needed them in the beginning. I thought that they were just another method of getting the treasures that any university holds in its faculty and its libraries and so on out through another channel to the public. I don't think that matters much anymore now. With the internet, with Google, I mean, you don't need a library where you've got Google. and so technology and modern ways of doing things have passed by the need for an educational or a public or a university television station.
Rome crumbled, all right? Why? We'll go through that. Why
Rome?
I'm not a futurist, but I'd look at what we call public broadcasting in this country now, and say that it's in its demise, because decline. It really is. When the evening more are selling you on selling us, you know, we could never raise money, you know.
Oh, you're talking about the Channel 8 now.
Yeah, the Channel 8 now. I'm talking about public broadcasting in the nation. It's one of many alternatives. And what is it that draws people there? It's not the lack of commercials anymore, because you can sell cheese and Chevrolets and cigars on public television now.
So if we have multi-channels, Nickelodeon for Children, Discovery and Learning Channel, all the things that were really the staple of public television, is it that public television's legacy is WGTV's legacy, is that they showed the way. They showed that it could be done. You could produce, you could make programming that was educational and entertaining at the same time, and essentially forge the trail that the other stations or cable networks.
Other commercial stations. I mean, I go back to my reference to Norman Lear. He was commercial, and he showed the way too. But yes, I do think we in a modest way, were a leader in this area for about 20 years.
When leadership was needed.
Yes.
And from the standpoint of availability of the things we used to produce. It's all over now. My wife and I just finished a series from the teaching company, watching it, DVDs, with some lecture from George Mason University, 30-minute lectures, all, just go through that. And now you don't have to do that. I can get them on iPod. I can do that.
That's true. And I've heard a lot of commentary about that, the fact that you can access anything. What I think we're missing, I'd like to get your opinion on this, is the fact that during the Watergate hearings, which public broadcasting nationally carried it gavel to gavel, not just summaries during the day, the entire country could feel that they were participating in that important part of democracy, and they did it through public television. They were exposed to all the fine British programming, Masterpiece Theater, and so on, through public television. That it truly was an alternative when an alternative was desperately needed.
Don't need it now, though. Don't need it now because you've got too many. Not too many. We have many people out producing things like. If we had Watergate now, it'd be covered by more than educational television. Yeah. Conventions are covered. We were a public television station and covered the 1964 Democratic and Republican national conventions. And I doubt that, I'll bet no more than a half a dozen public television stations at that time did that. And we sent Sylvan and had a camera, a film camera, and piked it back.
So if in some number of years, and some researchers watch this tape, this recording, and there isn't, as we know it, public television in existence, what kind of message do you want to send to future historians, future researchers, about what you attempted and succeeded at doing in the early days of public television in Georgia?
I have to hark back to the fact that universities, for centuries, decades at least, stayed in their ivory tower and were held in awe. Two things happened when continuing education, extension, the old, go back to some called Smith Act, who I've forgotten that created the Corporate Extension Service, all right? When you did that and opened up the university, and then the brilliance of the Kellogg people to create, now there are 26 of these things around, in London, all over, all kind of continuing education centers around, that kind of, in a way, force the university to expose that what's behind the ivy to the people. And now the new cadre of faculty coming on now grew up with that and do not expect to stay there. The young faculty I meet today, they're not in the office and wanting to hide behind their pile of academic jazz, They want the extension, how to get out there. And I think public television was one of those ways that opened up universities to the people, that people of the state, and also forced the universities to change a little bit. It's almost like, let me spin this one yarn, okay? I like when the GI Bill of Rights came into being back in those days, and said that anybody with a high school graduate, any soldier could go to any university. That opened up a thing. In fact, there's a story that President Conant of Harvard called Franklin Roosevelt and said, "Now, Franklin, we can't just accept anybody." And Franklin said, "Yes, we can, but we're going to democratize higher education." Now, that was a move that move opened up education, higher education, to the public, because 8 million of us went to college out of that deal. Now, this comes along with this another move. Now, what will be the next movement? I don't know. I think we're looking around. I think one of these days there'll be tours of these old buildings, and they'll say, now what went on there and what went on there, because the universities and the whole learning of the human being is taking on new things, taking on new natures now, and it's changing. It's changing all the time. I don't think that'll happen soon. Give it 200 or 300 years, you know, something like this. And but for some reason, I still think that people will have a television set in their homes because it's no longer television. It's another member of the family, and it's an open book. And I think those things will be there. You can see it on TV like that, but you can't see it. I think theaters will be here. The big screen. People still want to go at that experience and smell the popcorn, you know, and that's right. But I think the change. But the big change in the universities will be, I think, the whole thing that learning just becomes a natural part of breathing. I mean, it's no longer a thing you do; it's what you are. But I wax beyond my knowledge right there, far beyond my knowledge.
David, what's your message to the
50 years from now?
Yeah.
Should have been here. It was a great time.
I'd like to echo that because I wanted to say that, I mean, I went from being a viewer to as soon as I could. In high school, as soon as I could put my hands on a camera and start working in television, I did. And it's like, when I went into that control room, and it was like being on the bridge of a spaceship. And you guys let me work, and you paid me to be here. It was a grand adventure.
You did us a lot of good.
Well,
Neil Postman said something in the book he said, children are messages we send to the past that we will never know. And we send a message through what we did here to generations that we don't know how they'll look at it, what they will, but we did our best.
They'll laugh a little. They'll say, "Oh my, wasn't that interesting?" I think they'll find some of it interesting, and there'll be a studio like this. It'll be a museum sometime.
They will
and
be
this
more
is the camera
interested
work they did.
Why you brought these two old, long, white-haired men in here to represent the university. My God, it might be somebody else by then.
I used to look like that.